Ethan Harper had spent nearly 2 decades teaching at Ridgefield High School, a struggling institution in a small American town where hope often felt like a foreign concept. But within the 4 walls of his classroom, Ethan made it his mission to defy that narrative. He wasn't just a teacher, he was a believer. To him, every student was a puzzle waiting to be solved, every challenge an opportunity to inspire. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. It was early autumn, the kind of day where the sunlight streamed through the cracked windows, illuminating the dust motes that seemed to dance to the faint hum of life in the school. Ethan stood at the front of the classroom, his sleeves rolled up, gesturing passionately as he explained a science experiment. His voice carried a warmth that demanded attention without ever needing to raise itself. In the back corner of the room sat Liam Carter. His seat was the kind students gravitated toward when they wanted to disappear, but Ethan always noticed him. Liam had a quiet intensity about him, a sharpness in his gaze that hinted at untapped potential. His hoodie was frayed at the cuffs, and his sneakers had seen better days. A rumble from his stomach, faint but audible in the silent moments of class, betrayed the hunger he carried with him like a shadow. Ethan, mid-lecture, caught sight of Liam staring at the empty space on his desk where a notebook should have been. Without hesitation, Ethan crossed to his desk, retrieved a spare, and walked over to place it gently in front of Liam. "Keep up, Carter," he said, his tone light but his message clear. For a moment Liam hesitated, his fingers brushing the edges of the notebook. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of gratitude and embarrassment, before he muttered, "Thanks, Mr. Harper," and bent his head to work. As the class went on, Ethan's gaze shifted back to Liam, observing the way the boy hunched over his desk, his pencil moving quickly. He recognized the signs. The way Liam avoided eye contact, the way he clung to sarcasm like armor. It was all too familiar. Ethan carried his own ghosts, though he rarely spoke of them. A photo on his desk told part of the story. A smiling woman and a young boy standing beside him, their arms wrapped around each other in a moment frozen in time. It had been years since the accident, but the pain lingered, shaping his every decision. When he looked at Liam, he saw echoes of the son he'd lost, and that made it impossible to stand idly by. Later that afternoon, as the students filed out for lunch, Ethan lingered by the door. Liam was the last to leave, heading for the benches outside with a crumpled brown bag in hand. Curious, Ethan followed at a distance, leaning against the doorframe as he watched Liam unwrap the contents. 2 slices of plain bread and a single slice of processed cheese. The boy ate quickly, as if afraid someone might take it from him. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew this wasn't an isolated moment. Liam's attendance record was spotty, and his assignments, though thoughtful, often came back incomplete. Yet the boy never complained, never made excuses. As Ethan turned to head back inside, he found himself face to face with Ms. Vivian Monroe, the school's principal. She was a woman of sharp angles, from the cut of her suits to the precision of her words. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said, her voice cool and clipped. "It's come to my attention that you've been stepping outside your role, providing supplies, covering expenses." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I'm helping kids who need it." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not the point. We have rules, Ethan. Boundaries. If you keep undermining the system, there will be consequences." He held her gaze, his expression unwavering. "The system isn't working for kids like Liam." Monroe's eyes flicked toward the boy on the bench before returning to Ethan. "It's not your responsibility to fix." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor, leaving Ethan standing alone with the weight of her words pressing heavily on his shoulders. That night, Ethan sat in his small apartment, the same photo of his family propped on the kitchen table. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the silence as he stared at it, his mind replaying the day's events. "I won't fail another one," he murmured to himself, the resolve in his voice cutting through the stillness. The next day, Ethan greeted his class with the same energy, his determination undimmed. But as he glanced at Liam, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The challenges ahead weren't just about teaching. They were about fighting for the soul of a boy who the world seemed all too willing to forget. And Ethan wasn't about to let that happen. Liam Carter's situation had gone from difficult to dire. He showed up to school less often, and when he did, the signs of struggle were impossible to miss. His already worn clothes seemed looser, his face more drawn. The once quiet boy had grown quieter still, retreating into the shell he wore so tightly that it seemed impossible to crack. Ethan Harper noticed it all. He always noticed. The stack of overdue assignments piling up, the way Liam avoided eye contact during class discussions, and the growing number of days marked as absences on the attendance sheet. All red flags that painted a grim picture. The whispers in the faculty lounge confirmed Ethan's fears. Liam's family had fallen further behind on school fees, and rumor had it, the boy was working nights to help cover the bills. Worse, the school's administration had threatened to bar Liam from attending classes unless his parents settled the outstanding balance. Ethan couldn't stand by and watch. One day after school, he caught up with Liam just as the boy was heading toward the gate, his head bowed low. "Hey, Liam," Ethan called, his voice casual but firm enough to make Liam pause. The boy turned, shifting his backpack on his shoulder. "Yeah?" Ethan gestured toward the diner down the street. "Walk with me." Liam hesitated. He knew Mr. Harper meant well, but the attention made him uncomfortable. Still, he followed, his stomach betraying him with a growl as they stepped into the small diner. Over plates of burgers and fries, Ethan probed gently, asking about school, about life. At first, Liam deflected, but eventually, he let his guard down, revealing bits and pieces of the weight he carried. "They said I might not be able to come back next week," Liam muttered, staring at his fries. "Something about fees. My mom. She's doing her best, but it's not enough." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. He pulled out his wallet, leaving enough cash to cover their meal and a little extra for the waitress. "Don't worry about it," Ethan said, his tone calm but decisive. "We'll figure this out." The next day, Ethan quietly paid a portion of Liam's fees out of his own pocket. He didn't tell anyone, least of all Liam, who would have been mortified. But the small act didn't go unnoticed. In the faculty lounge, Ms. Vivian Monroe was reading through a report when Mr. Frank Dawson, a sharp-featured history teacher with an air of perpetual dissatisfaction, leaned against the counter, stirring his coffee. "Harper's at it again," Dawson said, his voice tinged with both irritation and amusement. Monroe looked up from her papers, her brow furrowing. "At what?" "Playing savior. Word is he's covering fees for that Carter kid." Dawson's smirk widened as he added, "It's one thing to inspire students. It's another to make the rest of us look bad while you break every rule in the book." Monroe's expression hardened. She prided herself on running a tight ship, and Ethan's tendency to blur lines tested her patience. "Leave it to me," she said curtly, gathering her things. That afternoon, Ethan was called into Monroe's office. The blinds were drawn, and the room carried the sharp scent of disinfectant. Monroe gestured for him to sit, her expression unreadable. "Ethan, we've talked about this before," she began, her tone clipped. "You cannot continue covering costs or providing resources for students out of your own pocket. It's against school policy." "They're not just students, Vivian," Ethan replied, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "They're kids. Kids who are falling through the cracks because this system cares more about numbers than their futures." Monroe's eyes narrowed. "The system has rules, Ethan, rules that exist for a reason. You're not helping them in the long run by enabling them." "Enabling?" Ethan's voice rose slightly before he caught himself. "I'm not enabling them. I'm giving them a chance. A fighting chance." Monroe leaned back in her chair, her lips pursed. "Consider this your final warning. If you continue overstepping boundaries, I'll have no choice but to escalate this to the school board." Ethan left the office with his jaw clenched and his mind racing. He knew the risks, but the thought of doing nothing felt like a betrayal. Not just to Liam, but to every student who needed someone to believe in them. Back in the classroom, Ethan's quiet determination burned brighter than ever, but trouble was brewing. Frank Dawson had overheard the meeting with Monroe and saw an opportunity. "Harper thinks he's some kind of hero," Dawson muttered to a colleague later that day. "But heroes fall harder than the rest of us." Dawson began watching Ethan more closely. his envy growing with every whispered thanks from a student, every rumor of Ethan's small acts of kindness. He bided his time, waiting for Ethan to slip, knowing it was only a matter of time before he'd have the ammunition he needed to take him down. In the meantime, Liam, unaware of the storm gathering around his favorite teacher, clung to the glimmers of hope Ethan had given him. But hope, as fragile as it was precious, would soon be tested. Ethan Harper stared at the invoice spread across his desk. The document was cold, clinical, a line-by-line reminder of everything that stood between Liam Carter and his education. The overdue fees totaled more than a teenager without a stable home could ever dream of paying. Ethan felt the weight of the paper in his hands, as though it carried the fate of Liam's future, and in a way, it did. The hallway outside his classroom was quiet, the final bell signaling the end of the school day. Ethan had waited until everyone was gone before pulling out his checkbook. His heart pounded in his chest, louder than it should have for what seemed like a simple act of kindness, but he knew better. He'd been warned. The pen hovered over the check as his mind raced through Monroe's last words. If you continue overstepping boundaries, I'll have no choice but to escalate this to the school board. Ethan pressed the pen down anyway, signing his name with a resolve that drowned out the voice of caution. The next morning, the payment cleared, and Liam's name was back on the attendance list. The relief was palpable in the way Liam walked into class, his head held a little higher. Ethan didn't say a word to him, but when their eyes met briefly, Liam's gratitude was unmistakable. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt like he could breathe. He'd done what was right, even if the system called it wrong. But not everyone saw it that way. Frank Dawson stood by the copy machine, watching through the glass window of Ethan's classroom. His sharp eyes caught the subtle exchanges between teacher and student, the quiet nods, the looks that carried more weight than they let on. To Frank, it was evidence, proof that Ethan was operating outside the bounds of professionalism. Later that day, he found the ledger in the office, a record of Liam Carter's fees, suddenly and mysteriously paid in full. Frank's lips curled into a grin. He didn't care about Liam's hardships or Ethan's intentions. All he saw was an opportunity to bring down the man who had outshone him for years. By the following afternoon, Ethan was summoned to Monroe's office. The room felt colder than usual, the blinds half drawn to let in a dim, gray light. Monroe sat behind her desk, her expression a mask of rigid professionalism. Beside her, Frank Dawson stood with his arms crossed, his smugness barely contained. "Ethan," Monroe began, her tone measured, "we've received information suggesting that you've paid a student's outstanding fees. Is that true?" Ethan felt the walls closing in, but he didn't flinch. "Yes, I did." Monroe's jaw tightened. "You understand that this is a violation of school policy?" Ethan leaned forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "I understand that without that payment, Liam Carter wouldn't have been allowed to attend class. He would have been out on the street instead of here, where he belongs." Frank interjected, his voice dripping with faux concern. "Ethan, rules exist for a reason. If everyone acted like you, this place would be chaos." Ethan's temper flared, his voice rising. "Chaos? You think chaos is a kid being denied an education because he's too poor to afford it? You think following rules is more important than giving someone a chance at a better life?" Monroe raised a hand, silencing the room. "This isn't about ideals, Ethan. It's about trust. You've broken it." Ethan's frustration spilled over. "If saving a kid's future is wrong, I don't want to be right." The room fell into a tense silence. Monroe's face softened, just for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't disagree with your intentions," she said quietly, "but your methods leave me no choice." Her words hit like a hammer. Ethan sat back, the fight draining from him as the reality of what was coming settled in. The news spread quickly. By the end of the day, every student, teacher, and parent in Ridgefield knew that Ethan Harper had been fired. Some rallied to his defense, circulating petitions and writing letters to the school board. Others, like Frank Dawson, reveled in his downfall. For Liam, the guilt was unbearable. He hadn't known what Ethan had done for him until the whispers reached his ears. Now, every bite of food, every step he took in the hallways, felt like a betrayal of the man who had sacrificed everything for him. Liam stopped showing up to class. He ignored Ethan's calls, avoiding the one person who might have helped him see beyond his shame. Instead, he retreated into himself, spending long nights wandering the streets or taking on dangerous odd jobs to scrape together what little he could. Ethan, meanwhile, packed up his classroom. The posters, the books, the photos of his students' achievements, all of it felt hollow now. As he taped up the last box, he found himself staring at the photo of his family. He thought of his son, of the future that had been stolen from him, and of the future he had tried so desperately to save for Liam. The weight of it all threatened to break him, but as he looked around the empty classroom, he made a silent promise. This wasn't the end. In the days that followed, the school buzzed with tension. Students protested, holding signs that read, "Bring back Mr. Harper," and "Education over rules." Ethan's name became a rallying cry, but the school board remained firm. Liam watched from the sidelines, torn between the guilt of what had happened and the spark of something new, a determination to prove that Ethan's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. For Ethan, the road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He had chosen compassion over conformity, and though it had cost him everything, he would do it again in a heartbeat. Ethan Harper sat at the edge of his bed in his small apartment, staring at a pile of unopened bills on the kitchen counter. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, a sound he'd never noticed before, but now seemed to echo through the emptiness. The absence of his daily routine, his students, and the familiar chaos of the classroom felt like a void he couldn't fill. Since his dismissal, Ethan's world had crumbled piece by piece. The school board's decision had been final, and the whispers in town painted him as either a martyr or a fool. Job offers were non-existent. Word of his termination had spread quickly, and no school wanted to take a chance on someone labeled a troublemaker. His savings dwindled faster than he anticipated, and the mounting financial strain weighed heavily on his already fragile spirit. The box of belongings he'd brought home from Ridgefield High still sat unpacked in the corner. Every time he looked at it, he felt the sting of loss. His passion for teaching, the purpose that had defined his life, now seemed like a cruel joke. For Liam Carter, life had taken a darker turn. The guilt of Ethan's sacrifice gnawed at him relentlessly. He hadn't returned to school since the day he learned what his teacher had done. How could he walk those halls, sit in that classroom, knowing Ethan had paid the price for his education? Instead, Liam disappeared into the shadows of the town, finding odd jobs wherever he could. At first it was small things, unloading trucks, cleaning diners after hours, and fixing fences for cash. But as his desperation grew, so did the risks he was willing to take. One evening, a man named Tyrell, a local gang member with a reputation for exploiting vulnerable kids, offered him work. "It's easy," Tyrell had said, sliding a backpack across the table. "You make the drop, you get paid. No questions, no problems." Liam hesitated, but the sight of his empty wallet and the thought of his family's unpaid rent silenced his doubts. He took the job. Ethan heard about Liam's disappearance through the grapevine. Students who came by to check on him mentioned Liam's absence, their voices tinged with worry. The guilt in Ethan's heart deepened. He couldn't stop replaying the moments leading up to his firing, wondering if he could have done something differently. One evening, while returning from a grueling shift at a hardware store, Ethan spotted Liam on the corner of a dimly lit street. He was with Terrell, handing off a package in exchange for a wad of cash. Ethan froze, his stomach dropping as the scene unfolded. He didn't need to ask questions to understand what was happening. Ethan approached cautiously, calling out Liam's name. The boy turned, his face pale under the streetlight. "Mr. Harper?" Liam's voice wavered, caught between surprise and shame. Terrell narrowed his eyes, stepping between them. "You know this guy?" "Yeah," Ethan said firmly, his gaze locked on Liam. "I know him, and he's coming with me." Tyrell smirked but didn't argue, sensing Ethan's resolve. He waved Liam off like he was dismissing a servant. "Do what you want, kid. Plenty more like you." Liam hesitated, but Ethan's outstretched hand left no room for debate. Without another word, Liam followed him. Back at Ethan's apartment, the tension was thick. Liam sat on the worn couch, his head in his hands, while Ethan paced the small living room. "What were you thinking?" Ethan finally asked, his voice sharp with worry. "Do you have any idea what could have happened to you?" Liam didn't answer right away. When he looked up, his eyes were red. "I didn't have a choice. You don't get it. I have nothing, Mr. Harper. No school, no future. I thought maybe I could fix things." Ethan's anger softened, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. He sat down across from Liam, his voice quiet but firm. "You're right, I don't get it. I don't know what it's like to be you. But I do know this isn't the way. You're worth more than that." Liam shook his head. Ethan reached out, placing a hand on Liam's shoulder. "I didn't do what I did because I expected something in return. I did it because I believe in you. That hasn't changed." The days that followed were tough, but Ethan refused to let Liam fall further. He found the boy safer work at the hardware store where he'd been hired, using what little influence he had left to vouch for him. Though it wasn't much, it was enough to keep Liam out of trouble and give him a shred of stability. Ethan's life didn't miraculously improve, but small acts of kindness sustained him. A former student dropped by with a basket of groceries. The owner of the diner where Ethan used to take Liam offered him free coffee during his shifts. Even in the face of adversity, Ethan found ways to give back. He began tutoring kids from the neighborhood in his apartment, using the same passion that had once filled his classroom. The laughter of the students and their moments of discovery reminded him why he'd become a teacher in the first place. Liam, too, started to see glimpses of hope. Working alongside Ethan gave him a sense of purpose, a reminder that he wasn't alone. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for Ethan and Liam, the worst was behind them. The fight wasn't over, but the small victories reminded them that even in the darkest moments, hope could still find a way to shine through. The sound of Ethan Harper's name being whispered in the local coffee shop was what first caught Rebecca Green's attention. Sitting by the window with her laptop open, the young journalist overheard snippets of conversation. "Fired for helping that kid," and "a teacher like that doesn't come around often." Rebecca, a Ridgefield High alum and now a reporter for the town's modest newspaper, had a knack for sensing a story. She closed her laptop and approached the two women in the booth nearby. "Excuse me," Rebecca said with a polite smile. "Are you talking about Ethan Harper?" The women exchanged a glance, one nodding hesitantly. "You heard about what happened?" Rebecca shook her head. "No, but I'd like to." By the time they finished explaining, Rebecca's notepad was half filled with details that made her blood boil. A teacher dismissed for doing the right thing? A kid on the brink of being abandoned by the system? This wasn't just a story, it was a call to action. Rebecca found Ethan later that evening. He was sitting in the dimly lit library, flipping through a worn book, but not really reading. The years hadn't changed him much, she realized. He still had that same determined yet kind expression she remembered from high school, though it now seemed weighed down by fatigue. "Mr. Harper?" she said softly, approaching him. Ethan looked up, surprised to see her. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Rebecca Green. "Wow, it's been a while." She smiled, pulling up a chair. "I heard about what happened. I'm a journalist now, and I want to tell your story." Ethan's face darkened. "There's no story here, Rebecca. I broke the rules and I'm paying the price." "That's not what I've heard," she countered. "I've talked to students, parents, even some of the staff. You didn't break the rules. You challenged a system that's broken. People need to know about this." Ethan shook his head, his voice weary. "I appreciate it, but I'm not looking for a spotlight. I just want to move on." Rebecca leaned forward, her voice insistent. "And what about Liam Carter? What happens to him if no one fights for kids like him? What happens to the next teacher who tries to do the right thing?" Ethan didn't respond, but the silence told her she'd struck a chord. Meanwhile, Liam was grappling with his own demons. The sight of Ethan struggling, working late nights at the hardware store, tutoring neighborhood kids for free, was a constant reminder of the sacrifice his teacher had made for him. Liam couldn't shake the guilt. One night, as he sat on the steps of his apartment building, a plan began to form. He didn't have much, but he could fight in his own way. The next day, Liam gathered a group of students who had also been touched by Ethan's kindness. They pooled their resources, small as they were, and began organizing a fundraiser, The idea was ambitious: bake sales, car washes, even a crowdfunding page. But Liam's determination was contagious. Word of the fundraiser spread quickly, and donations began trickling in. Local businesses offered to help, and soon the small movement grew into a community effort. But Liam wasn't finished. He knew the gang he'd worked for before still had a hold on other kids in his neighborhood. Confronting Tyrell was dangerous, but he couldn't stand by while others fell into the same trap. "Stay out of it, Carter," Tyrell warned when Liam approached him. "Or what?" Liam shot back, his voice steady despite the fear pounding in his chest. "I'm not afraid of you, and neither is anyone else." For the first time, Liam felt like he was standing up for something bigger than himself. Back in town, Rebecca's article was published under the headline, "Fired for Compassion, the Story of Ethan Harper." It wasn't just a retelling of events, it was a call to arms. Rebecca exposed the rigid policies that punish teachers for helping students and highlighted Ethan's unwavering dedication. The article ended with a pointed question: if educators like Ethan Harper aren't heroes, who is? The response was overwhelming. Letters poured into the editor's office, and the article went viral within the small town and beyond. Parents began questioning the school board's decision, and the hashtag Justice for Ethan started trending on social media. The attention infuriated Ms. Vivian Monroe and Frank Dawson. Monroe convened an emergency meeting with the board, claiming the article was a misrepresentation of the facts. Dawson, seizing the opportunity, added fuel to the fire by suggesting that Rebecca's report was an attack on the school's integrity. Harper's actions were reckless, Dawson argued. "We can't let sentimentality undermine the rules." But the tide was shifting. Students protested outside the school, holding signs that read, "Ethan Harper changed my life," and "Compassion isn't a crime." Rebecca and Liam became unlikely allies in the fight. While Rebecca kept the pressure on the school board through her reporting, Liam's fundraiser gained momentum, collecting enough to cover not only his own fees, but those of several other struggling students. Ethan, though still reluctant, couldn't deny the flicker of hope growing around him. He'd always believed in his students, but seeing them fight for him reminded him of why he had become a teacher in the first place. As the community rallied, Ethan and Liam found themselves at the center of a growing movement. Suspense lingered, the outcome uncertain, but one thing was clear: change was coming, and it had been sparked by the very people Ethan had devoted his life to helping. The auditorium was packed to capacity, a rarity in the sleepy town of Ridgefield. A banner stretched across the stage read, "State Academic Decathlon Finals," the bold letters gleaming under the bright lights. This was the day Liam Carter had worked for, though it felt surreal to stand there. Months ago, he wouldn't have imagined making it this far. Yet here he was, the underdog from Ridgefield High, about to compete against the best and brightest in the state. From the wings of the stage, Liam scanned the crowd. His nerves threatened to overwhelm him, until his eyes landed on Ethan Harper, sitting near the back. Ethan offered a small, encouraging nod. Despite the teacher's dismissal, he hadn't missed a single one of Liam's milestones. That silent support grounded Liam, fueling his determination to succeed. The competition was grueling: hours of problem-solving, public speaking, and lightning-fast trivia rounds. As the final scores were tallied, the host leaned into the microphone, his voice booming through the hall. "And the winner of this year's state academic decathlon is Liam Carter from Ridgefield High." The room erupted into applause. Liam stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding, before the realization hit him. He walked to the podium amidst the cheers, holding the small gold trophy as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. When the clapping died down, Liam cleared his throat, his voice unsteady but resolute. I didn't think this was possible," he began, his words raw with emotion. "A year ago, I was ready to give up. On school, on myself, on everything." He paused, looking out at the crowd, his gaze finding Ethan again. "But someone believed in me when no one else did. He showed me I wasn't just another kid who was going to slip through the cracks, that I could be more, that I mattered." The audience was silent now, captivated by Liam's vulnerability. "This trophy isn't just mine," Liam continued, his voice growing stronger. "It belongs to Mr. Harper. Without him, I wouldn't be standing here today. Ethan lowered his head, overcome by the weight of Liam's words. Around him, murmurs rippled through the crowd, and someone began clapping. Soon, the applause swelled into a standing ovation. The story of Liam's triumph spread like wildfire. Local reporters picked it up first, framing it as a tale of resilience and mentorship. But within days, national outlets took notice, diving into the backstory of Ethan Harper's dismissal and the boy who refused to let his teacher's sacrifice go unnoticed. Social media exploded with hashtags like Justice for Ethan and Teachers Matter, with posts highlighting Ethan's quiet acts of defiance against an unjust system. Donations poured into the fundraiser Liam had started, far surpassing its initial goal. At Ridgefield High, the atmosphere was tense. Ms. Vivian Monroe, who had prided herself on her no-nonsense leadership, now found herself at the center of a storm. Parents began demanding answers, questioning the policies that had led to Ethan's firing. The school board held an emergency meeting to address the growing backlash, but their attempts to justify their actions only made matters worse. Meanwhile, Frank Dawson tried to distance himself from the controversy, but his role in reporting Ethan was unearthed by Rebecca Green's investigative follow-up. The article painted Dawson as a petty opportunist, further fueling public outrage. Monroe and Dawson's reputations crumbled under the weight of scrutiny, their authority irreparably damaged. Ethan, however, was reluctant to step back into the spotlight. He kept his head down, continuing to tutor neighborhood kids and quietly support Liam from the sidelines. But when the school board finally caved to public pressure and invited him to speak at a special assembly, he couldn't refuse. The gymnasium was filled with students, parents, and faculty, the air electric with anticipation. Ethan stood at the podium, his familiar warmth tempered by humility. "I didn't become a teacher to break rules or make headlines," he began. "I became a teacher because I believe in the power of education to change lives. And that power doesn't come from policies or budgets. It comes from people." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "When I look at Liam Carter, I see proof of what's possible when someone is given a chance. This isn't about me. It's about every student who has ever needed someone to believe in them." The room erupted into applause once again, but this time, Ethan didn't look away. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of closure, not just for himself, but for the work he had dedicated his life to. As the evening wound down, Liam approached Ethan, holding the trophy in his hands. "This belongs to you," Liam said, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan shook his head. "No, Liam, you earned it. It's yours." "But I wouldn't have without you," Liam insisted. Ethan smiled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then let's call it ours." The miracle wasn't just Liam's success. It was the proof that one act of compassion, one teacher's unwavering belief, could ripple outward and transform not just a single life, but an entire community. Ethan's sacrifice had been the spark, and now, the fire of hope burned brightly. The offer came in the form of an official letter, delivered by hand to Ethan Harper's modest apartment. The school board had reversed their decision. With public opinion on his side and their reputation in tatters, they invited him to return to Ridgefield High School. But as Ethan sat at his kitchen table, the letter before him, he knew the answer immediately. Returning would mean going back to a system that valued bureaucracy over compassion. He wanted to do more, needed to do more. And so, with the same resolve that had guided him through the storm, Ethan made a different choice. Months later, the sound of laughter filled the air at the Ridgefield Community Learning Center. The small building, a repurposed warehouse on the edge of town, had been transformed into a hub for underprivileged students. The space buzzed with activity. Kids working on homework, painting murals, and building science projects under Ethan's guidance. Ethan moved among them with ease, his presence calm and reassuring. He paused at one table where a boy struggled with a math problem, kneeling beside him to explain it step by step. At the door, a familiar face appeared. Liam Carter stood with a backpack slung over one shoulder, a wide smile on his face. Now 18 and preparing for his first semester at college, Liam had traded his worn hoodie for confidence and purpose. "You're late," Ethan teased, looking up as Liam approached. "Some things never change," Liam shot back with a grin. He set his bag down and joined a group of younger kids, helping them construct a model for a science fair. The sight filled Ethan with pride. Liam wasn't just thriving, he was giving back, becoming the mentor he had once needed. As the evening wound down, Ethan and Liam sat on the steps outside the center, watching the last of the students leave. The sky was streaked with the soft colors of twilight, a quiet moment of reflection between them. Liam glanced at Ethan. "You know, you changed my life, Mr. Harper." Ethan smiled, his gaze distant but content. "No, Liam, you changed your life. I just reminded you that you could." After a pause, Ethan added, "When you change one life, you can change the world. Never forget that." Liam nodded, the words etching themselves into his heart. Together they sat in silence, two lives intertwined by compassion, their shared legacy just beginning. Inspired by this story? Subscribe now for more powerful tales of compassion, resilience, and the extraordinary impact of small acts of kindness. Join our community and be part of a movement that believes in changing lives, one story at a time. Don't miss out. Subscribe today.